The stone was new. That was the first thing he noticed, even before he read the name. The churchyard at Ashthorpe was full of old stones, their letters soft with lichen, their edges rounded by decades of rain and frost, the way grief eventually rounds everything. This one stood crisp and sharp among its neighbors, its carved letters still carrying the pale freshness of newly worked marble, untouched, yet by the slow, patient work of weather. Edmund Hartwell, it read, Earl of Ashthorpe, born 1784. Died at the Battle of Salamanca, 1812. He stood in the gate with his road coat still gray from the journey, and read his own name and could not, for a long moment, think of a single thing to say. He was not, in point of fact, dead. In point of, he had come a great distance under that misunderstanding, and he was very tired, and the autumn morning was cold enough that his breath showed in the air before him, and on the stone's low ledge someone had placed a small sprig of rosemary, its leaves still faintly green and fragrant, fresh enough that it could only have been set there within the last day or two. He reached toward it, not quite touching. Then he heard the grass behind him, and he turned. She was not yet aware of him. She walked with her head slightly bent, a small bunch of the same rosemary held in both gloved hands, her plain gray mantle not quite adequate to the morning cold. And she moved through the churchyard with the unhurried purposefulness of someone performing an act she had performed many times before. She looked up when she was 10 feet away. She stopped. The rosemary fell from her hands, and she did not look at it. Edmund, said Cecily Vane. She said it the way one says a word, that one has said in private 10,000 times, but never aloud. Not as a question, not as a cry, simply as a name returned to the air where it belonged. He could not speak at all. He had rehearsed on the long road from Southampton what he would say when he saw her. None of those words were present now. There was only the churchyard and the cold morning and the sprig of rosemary on the stone shelf of his own grave, and Cecily Vane standing very still at the end of the path, her face the color it had always been, her eyes the same dark gray they had been the last time he looked at them in anger and turned away. The Battle of Salamanca had been fought on a July afternoon in 1812 in the dust and heat of the Spanish plain, and for a great many men on both sides it had resolved in the most final way possible. For Major Edmund Hartwell it had resolved differently, though not by much. A fragment of shrapnel had taken him down near the Spanish line as his regiment pressed forward. He had lost consciousness before the ground came up to meet him, and had woken, much later, in a French prisoners' hospital outside Bayonne, with his name entered in a ledger as unknown, his rank uncertain, and his regiment long since moved north. The report of his death had reached Ashthorpe by October. He knew this because a French officer with better manners than most had eventually thought to consult the English casualty lists, and had found, to his evident satisfaction, that he had harbored a living earl for 15 months without knowing it. The correction was made. The exchange was arranged. The journey home took 3 months more than it ought, because the roads in winter were what they always were, and because Edmund was not entirely well, and because there were moments, in the long cold crossing, when he was not certain what he was returning to. He was not certain of it now, standing in the gate of the Ashthorpe churchyard with his own headstone before him, and her not 10 feet away. He had thought about her. That was the plain fact of it, the one he had carried across France and the Channel and the English roads like a stone in his coat. He had thought about the last morning in this county, before he rode south. He had thought about the quarrel. He had thought about the exact phrasing of his worst sentence, the one that had been designed to end the argument rather than answer it, the one he could feel the weight of still. She had said she was afraid. He had said that fear was not a reason. She had said something else, something quieter, that he had chosen to hear as a failure of faith. And he had put on his coat and gone. 2 years in a French prisoner's hospital gave a man a great deal of time in which to revise his readings of old conversations. He had revised that one considerably, in the dark, in the intervals between fever and the fitful sleep that followed it. He had decided that she had been right, and he had been intractable, and that it did not greatly matter, because whatever had been between them had presumably been dissolved by the report of his death, if not before. He had not expected Rosemary on the stone. For Cecily, the 2 years since October of 1812 had arranged themselves around a single fixed point, the way a room arranges itself around a hearth, not by choice, but by the logic of warmth and absence. The fixed point was the stone. She had not ordered it herself. That had been Lady Harriet Hartwell's doing, Edmund's mother, who had moved swiftly through her grief and into the practical business of the estate, with a speed that had struck more than one observer as efficient. The stone had been cut and set by the following March, and Cecily had gone to look at it once, and then had found herself going back, and then had stopped pretending that she did not go every week. She had been betrothed to Edmund since she was 20 years old. Her father and his had arranged it with the warmth of long neighbors and the satisfaction of men who believed they knew their children. She had been 20 when he placed his family's ring on her finger, and 22 when he rode south to join his regiment. And what had happened in between those two events was not, in the view of Ashthorpe society, a great romance. But it had been real to her in the way that only the things one cannot explain are real. She had begged him not to go. She knew now that she had done it badly. She had spoken from fear rather than faith. And he had heard the difference, and his face had done what his face always did when he was wounded, which was to go absolutely still, and say something precise and final, and leave the room. He had not been unkind, exactly. He had simply been someone who did not know, or would not allow himself, to stay. To the household at Ashthorpe, Cecily was now something the estate had not quite found a name for. She was the former betrothed, which made her neither family nor guest, neither servant nor dependent, and Lady Harriet had managed this ambiguity with the particular skill of a woman who had long experience in keeping useful things close without quite acknowledging their use. Cecily had stayed because she had nowhere else to go. Her father was dead. Her one sister had married well enough and had not extended an invitation. And the grave was here, and someone needed to tend it. It was Nigel Carew who had named her situation most clearly in September in a conversation she had been intended to overhear. She had been in the passage outside the library when she heard him say to his man, with the breezy certainty of someone who believed himself already master of the estate, that Lady Harriet was right to keep the soldiers left over close. More convenient than a settlement, he had said. She had stood in the passage and let the phrase settle over her like cold water. And then she had gone back to her room and written another page of the letter she had been writing, in fragments for 2 years, to a man she knew could never read it. The letter was folded in the drawer of her writing table. It had begun as a formal notice of the engagement's dissolution, and had become, over many months of revision, something else entirely. Edmund walked into Ashthorpe Hall on the afternoon of the same day he stood in the churchyard gate. He had given Cecily a moment to find her breath, and then had said, quietly, that he supposed they should go inside. She had not argued. She had walked beside him with 6 inches of air between them that felt, to both of them, like a much greater distance. And they had said nothing of consequence on the short walk from the churchyard to the house, and neither had remarked on the rosemary she had left behind in the grass. The hall received him with a silence that was not welcoming. 3 footmen stood in the entry, which was two more than necessary, which meant that word had already traveled from the churchyard, which meant that someone had been watching. His mother appeared at the top of the stair a full minute after he entered, which was long enough to have composed herself, but not quite long enough to have decided what to feel. Lady Harriet Hartwell was a woman of 60, who had spent 40 of those years in the management of other people's affairs and had grown very skilled at it. She came down the stairs with her spine straight and her expression calibrated to welcome, and she embraced her son in the way one embraces something one has arranged to accept, but did not quite expect. Edmund returned the embrace and said nothing, and she stepped back and looked at him with eyes that were measuring something he could not immediately name. "We were told you were dead," she said, as though he might have been unaware. "I was not," he said. Behind her, Nigel Carew stood in the library doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and his posture arranged to suggest that this was an inconvenience of a minor and manageable kind. He was 34, well-built, with the easy confidence of a man who had been told his entire life that things would work out in his favor. He had a plausible claim on the earldom, though not a clear one, and he had been pressing it with the measured patience of someone who understood that these things required time. He looked at Edmund now with the careful smile of a man recalculating and said that it was very good news, that it was really quite fitting, that everyone was tremendously glad. Edmund looked at him for a moment, and then looked at his mother, and then looked briefly at Cecily, who stood at the edge of the hall with her hands folded and her face composed into the particular expression she wore in public, the one that gave nothing away. "Miss Vane," he said, "you must be cold. Come to the fire." It was not kindly said. It was not unkindly said. It was said the way one gives an instruction to someone in one's household, and Cecily heard it as exactly that, and followed, because there was nothing else to do. The drawing-room fire was lit, and the tea was brought, and Edmund sat in what had been his father's chair and listened to his mother explain, with the practiced clarity of a woman who had given the matter extensive thought, what had been decided in his absence. The estate management had, of course, devolved to Nigel. Certain legal processes had been initiated, which Mr. Brent the solicitor had overseen, but which could naturally be undone now that the situation was clarified. She said these things with the tone of someone describing minor household adjustments. Edmund listened without interrupting. Cecily sat near the window and looked at the garden, and was not asked for her opinion on any of it. He asked in the evening if she would walk with him to look at the kitchen gardens. She agreed. They walked in the near dark along the stone path, and he looked at the beds and said nothing for a long time. And then he said, without preamble, that she ought to know his intentions were to have things properly settled by Christmas. She said, carefully, that she understood. He said that he did not mean to make any demands on anyone's arrangements. She said that was very good of him. He stopped walking and looked at her in the fading light with an expression she could not read, and she looked back at him with the same composure she had held all day, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the cold, like two people who had once known each other very well and were no longer certain they had the right to say so. "Cecily," he began, and then stopped. She waited. He did not continue. He turned and walked back toward the house, and she followed at the 6 inches of distance, and the kitchen garden was quiet behind them. The estate, Edmund discovered in the days that followed, was not in the condition he had left it. Not in the way of neglect. The opposite, in fact. The tenant accounts were in order. The home farm had been managed through the winter with better judgment than he would have applied himself, and the disputes that invariably arose in any large holding over water rights and grazing permissions had been resolved with a quiet efficiency that had left no party feeling entirely wronged, which was considerably better than the usual outcome. He found this out piece by piece, from his steward, from the tenants themselves when he rode out to introduce himself to a dozen men who had been told he was dead, and from Mrs. Fawcett, his old housekeeper, who had a habit of entering rooms when she was needed, that he had always found uncanny, and now found that he needed to rely on. Mrs. Fawcett was 60, small, and impervious to the social weather of the house in the way that only very long-tenured household staff can be. She had served his father before him, and had a settled opinion on every member of the family, which she had communicated over the years through a combination of expression and strategic silence. She told him, in the matter-of-fact tone she reserved for important information, that Miss Vane had managed the accounts from November of 1812 through the previous spring, when Lady Harriet had given Nigel formal authority, and Cecily had quietly stepped back to allow it. He said nothing. Mrs. Fawcett said that she thought he ought to know. He rode out 3 days after his return to inspect the eastern fields, which had been the subject of a water dispute the year previous. He went alone, early, before the household was properly awake, because he needed the cold air and the space and the particular silence that only an empty October field provides. He was returning along the lane that ran behind the home farm when he heard voices from the direction of the Miller cottage, one raised and one very quiet, and something in the quality of the quieter voice made him rein the horse without thinking about it. The raised voice was Nigel's. He was telling the tenant Miller, with the breezy authority of a man who had been practicing at being master of the estate for 2 years, that the arrangement he had in place would have to be reconsidered. There was a great deal of language about the terms of the lease and the irregularities of the prior agreement, and the substance of it, stripped of its legal coating, was that he wanted the Millers out by spring. The quiet voice was Cecily's. She had apparently been walking from the house when she encountered this exchange, and she was now saying, without any particular change in her tone, that the arrangement Mr. Miller held had been reviewed in January and confirmed as sound, and that she had a copy of the relevant document at the house should Mr. Carew wish to inspect it, and that she rather thought, on reflection, that the matter was now Lord Ashthorpe's to resolve, as he was in residence and in health, and was, she believed, the proper authority for decisions of this nature. There was a silence. Then Nigel said that she was, of course, quite right, and that he would speak to Edmund about it. And his tone was the tone of a man who had said something to himself, privately, that he was not saying aloud. Edmund waited until he heard footsteps receding, and then waited a little longer before he rode on. He did not know, precisely, what he had expected of her, after 2 years in this house under his mother's management and Nigel's increasing presumption. He had not expected this. He had not expected her to cite the lease document from memory, or to redirect the dispute to him with the quiet efficiency of someone who has thought clearly about where authority properly rests. He had not expected, if he was honest, to find himself sitting on a horse in an October lane with something shifting in his chest that had no convenient name. He rode back to the house and said nothing about what he had heard. She was in the library that evening when he came to review the accounts. She rose to leave, and he said she might as well stay, since she knew the figures better than he did, and she sat back down with her composure arranged firmly in place and answered his questions when he asked them. She sat across the broad library table from him with the candles between them, and the firelight moved on the shelves behind her, and when she leaned forward to point to a column of figures, her hand was 6 inches from his on the table, and he was aware of that 6 inches with a precision that was entirely inconvenient. She looked up and found him looking at her. He looked back at the account book. She said neutrally that the November figures were on the next page. He said yes. The Ashthorpe tenants knew within a week that the Earl was home, and the neighborhood was somewhat more cautious, because the neighborhood was always cautious about facts that complicated arrangements it had already made. A dinner was held at Whitmore Park, the neighboring family's estate, some 10 days after Edmund's return. It was the first occasion at which he and Cecily and Nigel and the collected opinion of the county had been in a room together, and everyone in the room was aware of this, including the people pretending not to be. It was a Mrs. Culverton Price, the vicar's wife, who said, leaning toward the woman beside her in a way that was not quite as discreet as she believed, that it was all very well his turning up alive, but that things had gone rather too far for easy untangling, and that poor Miss Vane was in a very awkward position, and that really, the soldier's leftover was what she had always been, through no fault of her own, and it was a pity, a real pity. Cecily, who was standing close enough to hear this, did not change her expression. She took a small sip of her wine and looked at the arrangement of candles on the sideboard and said, to the woman on her other side, something pleasant about the autumn flowers. Edmund did not hear this exchange. He was across the room with the host, discussing the latest dispatches from the continent, when his mother drew him aside. She said it in the way she said difficult things, which was with her eyes on some middle distance, as though the information were arriving to her also as a surprise. Nigel, she said, had been consulting with Mr. Brent. The 2-year absence, combined with the circumstances of the casualty report, had created a legal complexity regarding the earldom's continuity. This was not, Lady Harriet said, something she had arranged. It was something that had simply arisen. She said this in a tone that did not quite invite examination. Edmund looked at her for a moment, and then looked across the room to where Cecily stood near the window, very still, with her composed face firmly in place. His mother said, further, that Nigel had made his intentions regarding Miss Vane quite clear, and that it was her understanding that Cecily had not refused him, that the situation was, she believed, in process, and that perhaps that was for the best, given the complications, and that she hoped Edmund would understand that everything had been done in the interests of stability. He excused himself from the dinner early, which was noticed. He walked back to Ashthorpe in the dark, which was 2 miles, and stood in the library for 20 minutes without lighting a candle, which was not something he could have explained to anyone. And then he put on his coat and went back out into the cold night and walked to the churchyard. The stone was still there, of course. It would be there until someone took a chisel to it. He stood in front of it and read his name again, and his dates, and the carved record of a death that had not happened, and he thought about the word stability, and what it cost, and who paid for it. Mrs. Fawcett had found him before he left. She had appeared in the library doorway with the particular timing that suggested she had not been far, and she had said, plainly, that she thought he ought to know what Mr. Carew had said about Miss Vane at Whitmore Park. The phrase she used was the soldier's leftover. She said it without any inflection at all, and watched him hear it. And then she said, also without inflection, that in her 30 years at Ashthorpe, she had never seen anyone tend that estate with more care than Miss Vane had, and that she did not believe a woman who kept the rosemary fresh on a stone for 2 years had done so out of obligation. He stood at the grave in the cold October dark and looked at his own name and thought about what it meant that she had been here, in this churchyard, every week for 2 years. He had not allowed himself to think about it directly. He had constructed from the quarrel and the absence and his mother's careful management of information a version of events in which Cecily had moved through her grief and found the arrangements convenient, and was, at bottom, relieved to have the whole business resolved one way or another. He had constructed this version with some care, because it was the only version in which his behavior on the last morning was defensible. If she had grieved, truly grieved, then he had left her with cruelty in his last words, and that was a weight he had not been willing to take up. He was standing at his own grave in the dark, with that weight fully upon him when he heard the gate. She had not gone home from Whitmore Park after he left. She had waited 20 minutes, and then made her excuses, and walked the 2 miles in the same cold dark. And she knew where he would be, because she knew him, which was not a thing she had allowed herself to claim until now. She came through the gate and stopped when she saw him, and he turned. And for a moment they simply stood there with the stone between them and the cold night around them, and the particular quality of silence that a churchyard has at night, which is not empty silence, but full silence, weighted with everything that has already been said. She reached into her mantle and took out a folded letter. She held it for a moment, not yet extending it, and then she crossed the short space between them and placed it in his hand. "I wrote this in pieces," she said. "Over 2 years. I could not send it because you were dead, and then you were not, and I could not find the words to say it aloud. I would prefer you read it here, where you can be alone with it after." He looked at the letter in his hand. He looked at her face, which had abandoned its composure entirely, which was the first time in 10 days that he had seen it do so. "Cecily," he said. "Please just read it," she said. "I will go." She turned. He said her name again, sharply enough that she stopped. He opened the letter there in the dark and read it by the gray light of the half-moon, and it took him some minutes, because it was many pages, written across 2 years in a hand that changed as the seasons changed. She had begun with the formal dissolution of the betrothal, the language correct and measured and cold. By the 3rd page, the language had changed. By the 6th, it was something else entirely. She had written about the morning he left. She had written that she had been afraid, which he knew. But she had also written precisely what she had been afraid of, which was not his death in the abstract, but the specific fact that he would go believing she thought less of him than she did. She had been afraid that his last image of her would be her clutching at his coat sleeve, and she had said it badly, and he had left, and she had been right about the last image, because he had carried it all the way to France. She had written that she was sorry for the way she had said it, and not for what she had meant, which was only that she loved him, and could not bear the world's arrangements when they took him away. She had written that she kept the rosemary fresh because there was a superstition in the county that rosemary was for remembrance, and she had no other way to keep his name alive in a house that was already busy forgetting it. He folded the letter and stood at the stone for a moment. Then he walked to where she had stopped, near the gate, and stood behind her without touching her. "I owe you a letter," he said. "I owe you a great many things." She turned. He was very close. The cold was sharp around them, and their breath clouded in the space between their faces. "You said you had no faith," he said. "I told you that fear was not sufficient reason. I was wrong. I went because I was afraid not to, because the alternative was to stay in a county that had decided exactly what I was, and never find out if they were right. That was the reason I could not say aloud. And I made it yours instead." He paused. "I am sorry. Very sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. "I kept the rosemary fresh," she said, "because I could not do anything else." "I know," he said. "I understand that now." He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked back to the house together in the cold dark, and the churchyard was quiet behind them, and neither of them said anything else until the lights of Ashthorpe came into view. And then they talked, quietly and for a long time, about the things that could be said at last. The dinner at Whitmore Park resumed the following Thursday, as these things always did in a county that ran on the rhythm of its social calendar regardless of events. Edmund attended this time in full, which was itself a communication to everyone who understood how such things were communicated. He arrived with his mother in the carriage, and Cecily beside her, and Nigel, who had his own horse, found them all already assembled in the Whitmore drawing room when he arrived. There were 30 people in the room. Mr. Aldous Brent, the family solicitor, stood near the fire because he had been invited specifically for the purpose of the evening, and he was a man who understood when his presence at a social occasion was professional rather than personal. Nigel had dressed with care. He crossed the room to Cecily within 10 minutes of his arrival, which was the minimum social interval consistent with not appearing too eager. And he spoke to her with the particular warmth of a man executing a plan he has prepared. Edmund watched this from the far side of the room, next to the host, and said nothing and continued his conversation. It was when the party moved toward supper that Nigel chose his moment. He raised his glass with the easy confidence of a man who had spent 2 years imagining this evening, and said to the assembled company that he had an announcement which would give him great pleasure to make, which was that he and Miss Vane had reached an understanding, and that he hoped their friends would join him in welcoming the very great good fortune that the coming year would bring. The room was briefly very still. Edmund set down his glass. He crossed the drawing room in 3 strides, which was not a great distance, but which every person in the room tracked precisely, because there is a quality of movement that commands attention, and he was producing it. He stopped beside Cecily. She had not moved. She was very pale and very still, her hands quiet at her sides, and she was looking at Edmund with an expression that was not a question, but was the face of someone waiting for a fact. He looked at Nigel. Then he looked at the room. "Miss Vane has been my promised wife since before the war," he said. The words were 12 words, level, and said in the voice he used when a thing was simply true. Not loud, not theatrical. Simply stated, the way one states a property right or a legal condition, in the same room where the solicitor was standing with his papers and his particular expression of professional readiness. Mr. Brent cleared his throat and said that he happened to have the betrothal contract with him, as it had been the subject of some recent inquiry, and that its terms, on close examination, remained binding. Nigel's face did what faces do when the ground moves, which is to become very careful. He said something about the complexity of the situation and the question of Edmund's 2-year absence, and his voice had the faint upward quality of a man whose certainty is looking for a handhold that is no longer there. Lady Harriet stood near the doorway and said nothing at all. This was the first time, to anyone's knowledge, that she had stood in a public room and offered no opinion on a matter concerning her son's estate. A woman beside her said something in a low voice, and Lady Harriet did not respond, and her fan was very still in her hand. The room had 30 people in it, and 30 people's attention had been arranged by Nigel's announcement in one direction and then redirected all at once in a way that felt like a tide turning. There was not triumph in the room exactly. There was something quieter, which was the feeling of a record being corrected, a misreading set right, the particular satisfaction that an assembled company feels when what ought to have been true turns out to be. Edmund offered Cecily his hand. She took it. They were not exactly touching, even then, which was correct for a drawing room with 30 witnesses, but his hand was beneath hers, and he did not move it, and she did not remove it. And this said everything that 12 words cannot contain. Nigel excused himself shortly afterward. He was pleasant about it. He shook Edmund's hand, which was gracious, and said something about misunderstandings all around, which was the most he could do. And Edmund thanked him for his care of the estate in the past 2 years, which was the most Edmund could do. And neither of them was wrong exactly, which was the particular mercy the occasion offered. The solicitor stayed long enough to confirm what needed confirming, and then folded his papers and took his leave. The party continued another hour. Cecily sat beside Edmund near the fire, and for the first time in 11 days, she did not hold her face composed against the possibility of further news. If anyone present noticed that she had been crying in a quiet and entirely private way, they were kind enough not to say so. 2 days later, in the late morning, Edmund walked to the churchyard alone. He brought a chisel and a small mallet, which he had borrowed from the stonemason in the village without explanation. And the stonemason had said nothing and handed them over, because a man borrowing a chisel to work on his own headstone did not require explanation. He did not strike out the name or the dates. He added 2 lines below, in rough letters that would be properly finished later, in a different hand, by someone who knew what they were doing. He chiseled the lines himself because they wanted to be in his own hand, even if the execution was imperfect. Cecily found him there an hour later. She stood beside him and read the lines. One was a correction, the briefest possible, noting that the stone's conclusion had been premature. The other was a dedication, of the kind that sometimes appears on gravestones and sometimes on other things, which noted only that a woman of particular courage had kept faith here for 2 years, and that he was grateful for it. She read it twice. He watched her read it. "This is a great deal of trouble for a stone," she said. "It wanted explaining," he said. She looked at him then, and she was smiling, which was a thing he had not seen her do since before the war. And it arrived on her face the way warmth arrives after cold, all at once and entirely. He reached into his coat and took out a letter. He held it for a moment, the same way she had held hers in the dark, and then he placed it in her gloved hands. It was 1 page. He had written it the night before, at the library table, in the same chair where he had reviewed the estate accounts by candlelight, with her on the other side. It said, among other things, that he had intended to say several of these things at the church in October, but had been somewhat overwhelmed by finding his own name in stone, and that he hoped she would forgive the delay. It said that he had been wrong about the quarrel, and wrong to go as he had gone, and wrong to construct, from the silence of imprisonment, a story in which she had not waited. It said that he did not know quite how to ask for what he was asking, which was not the resumption of a betrothal, but the beginning of something they had not had time for before, which was the actual choosing of each other, in full knowledge of what had been between them and what it had cost. She read it. He waited, which was harder than the 2 years had been, in certain respects, because hope is harder to hold than grief. She folded the letter and held it with both hands and looked at the churchyard. "I have a pressed sprig of rosemary in my drawer," she said. "I put it there the first autumn. I could not bear to leave it on the stone every week and take nothing home." He did not say anything. "I will get it," she said. She met him at the churchyard gate 20 minutes later, the rosemary pressed flat and faintly fragrant still, held in one gloved hand. He took it from her with some care, as one takes a thing that matters, and they stood in the gate together with the pale autumn light on the stone, and his name written in it. Corrected now, with its additional lines. Imperfect in execution and very clear in meaning. Mrs. Fawcett, watching from the kitchen garden path with the particular timing she always had, turned back toward the house and said nothing to anyone. The rosemary he put in his own coat pocket. he would press it flat again between the pages of his father's Bible, which was where the family had always kept the things that were not to be lost. He had not told her this yet. There were many things they had not yet told each other. Which was, he thought, not a loss, but a provision. The particular richness of people who have kept themselves for each other without knowing that was what they were doing. She took his arm at the gate, which was not quite correct for an unaccompanied walk in a county that noticed these things. He did not suggest otherwise. They walked back through the village, and the morning was clear and cold, and Ashthorpe was before them, and his name was still on the stone, but differently now, which was enough. The season would come. There would be a solicitor, and a vicar, and a drawing room assembled at the appropriate moment. There would, in time, be the quiet ceremony, and the estate properly settled, and the rosemary in its Bible page, permanent and fragrant still. That was all to come. What there was now was the lane and the cold October light and the arm she had placed in his, and they walked in the quiet of two people who have, after a very long time, agreed on the same direction. Thank you for staying with Edmund and Cecily until the end. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that mattered most.